Hello, I'm Esther Githu. It's Monday, January 23rd. This is Africa 54. And we begin our broadcast in Somalia, where the Al-Shabab terror group on Sunday killed 5 civilians following an attack on a government building in Somalia's capital. We warn you that this report contains graphic images and viewer discretion is advised. Here's David Doyle with more.
An al-Qaeda-linked group stormed a government building in Somalia's capital on Sunday, the Ministry of Information said. Al-Shabab attackers detonated a bomb before entering a block that houses the office of Mogadishu's mayor around noon. The ministry said security had killed 6 militants and cleared the area by 6 p.m. 5 civilians died, the ministry said. A police spokesperson put the death toll at 6, and the director of an ambulance service said they had transported 8 civilian bodies. Al-Shabab has stepped up attacks in a show of resilience after President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud's government launched a renewed offensive in August. The group has been fighting the government since 2006 and seeks to impose its own interpretation of Islamic law. It frequently carries out bombings and gun attacks across the country. Sunday's attack was in a well-guarded area of the capital, with concrete barriers and multiple roadblocks.
For more on this latest attack by Al-Shabab terrorist group, I'm joined by Haroon Maruf, VOA senior editor with Somali Service. Haroon, welcome back to Africa 54.
Thank you.
Now, do we know how this terror group was able to get into a secure place such as the mayor's building without anybody detecting that they were anywhere near there?
Yeah, Al-Shabaab is always changing tactics. When the government erects roadblocks around key installations, Al-Shabaab puts on military uniform, police uniforms in order to masquerade as security forces. In this case, that's what happened. They did not take vehicles to reach their target because they cannot pass through the roadblocks. Instead, they opted to walk on foot until they reached their destination. And while they were walking to the administrative capital, headquarters of Mogadishu, nobody had asked them who you are because they were wearing military uniform. And everybody thought they were members of the military security personnel. And that's probably one of the reasons that they disguised it, that helped them reach their target. But Al-Shabaab also always pretends to be members of security forces. That's how they go through checkpoints, and they are very much part of the society. There is no special sign that says this person is Al-Shabaab and this person is not Al-Shabaab.
Just last week, they killed a military commander. Do we know who their target was yesterday?
In this case, they targeted the administrative headquarters of Mogadishu. That means this is where the security decisions, political decisions of the capital are decided. This is where the mayor sits. So it's a very important building. If you remember, in July 2019, they targeted the same building. A female suicide bomber detonated and fatally injured then Mayor Abdurrahman Umar Osman Yeriso. So this was very ambitious attack by Al-Shabaab to cause maximum casualties among the people who are working at the capital, who are making key decisions, security, political decisions.
You know, Al-Shabaab weekend attacks have become so frequent. It's almost, predictable right now. What are intelligence officials and security forces in Somalia saying that could be behind this trend of weekend attacks?
Yeah, the security officials were expecting this kind of reaction from Al-Shabaab, because whenever Al-Shabaab is under pressure from the government, from security branches, and we know that Somali government and local forces are carrying out attacks in the countryside to take cities and villages from Al-Shabaab, Al-Shabaab retaliates in order to exact revenge on the government, but also to undermine the operations that are against them. And one of the biggest places they would be expected to attack is the administrative capital of Mogadishu. That's where the mayor sits, that's where the security officials sit as well of the capital. And the other thing is that historically, whenever there is a security operation against Al-Shabab, they usually carry out tit-for-tat attacks against the government. That's why we have seen this military raid in forward operating bases far away from the capital, as well as the capital. Because they are under pressure, they wanted to show that they can also strike at the heart of the government, the capital.
Oh, it calls for beefing up of security, especially that the masquerade as military forces. Harun, thank you very much for your insight. Harun Maruf is a senior editor with VOA's Somali service. Here in Washington, White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby announced Friday that the U.S. Treasury Department will designate the Wagner Group, a Russian private military company, as a significant transnational criminal organization in the coming days. The Treasury will also impose additional sanctions on the group that has been aiding Russia's military in its ongoing invasion of Ukraine. He said the designation will allow the administration to hit Wagner with tougher sanctions and squeeze its ability to do business around the world. Eritrean troops have left the ancient city of Axum in Tigray, but remain in 2 other towns in the war-stricken Ethiopian region, according to local residents. The United States hailed a pullout seen as key to a landmark peace deal. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke on Saturday of their ongoing withdrawal in a telephone call with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, calling it significant progress in the peace agreement. Paul Ndiho has more.
Eritrean forces have been leaving towns in the war-torn region of Tigray, a move seen as a key to a landmark peace deal. Fighting between federal troops and the Tigray rebels erupted in northern Ethiopia in November 2020. It raged on for 2 years before the two sides signed a peace deal in South Africa's capital, Pretoria, on November 2nd, 2022. Under the agreement, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, agreed to disarm and re-establish the federal government's authority in return for the Ethiopian government reopening access to the war-torn region in dire need of food and aid. But the Pretoria Agreement made no provision for the withdrawal of Eritrean troops, who fought on the federal government side and were accused by the United States and human rights groups of some of the worst abuses in the bloody conflict. On the ground in Tigray, locals said that the convoys of Eritrean troops have been leaving the towns of Shere and Adawa, although some soldiers remained. However, Eritrean soldiers were still walking the streets and around the market over the weekend. With access to Tigray limited, it's impossible to verify the situation on the ground independently. Moreover, the withdrawal has yet to be confirmed by the peace deal signatories or the agreement's observation mission. Addis Ababa and Asmara denied any Eritrean involvement in the conflict for months, but Abiy Ahmed later admitted their presence in March 2021. The departure of Eritrean troops has been announced several times before, but never verified. Earlier this month, Tigray forces began handing over heavy weaponry to Ethiopia's national army as part of an African Union-led peace process. The handover, which took place around 20 miles northeast of the region's capital, Mekelle, was overseen by a monitoring team comprised of members of the two sides and a regional body, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. The exact toll of the war, which has primarily come to an end, remains unknown. However, the International Crisis Group think tank and Amnesty International have called it one of the deadliest in the world. The conflict has displaced more than 2 million people and left millions needing humanitarian aid. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is in Zambia Monday as part of a 3-nation tour of Africa that began in Senegal. Yellen says it is critically important to restructure Zambia's debt and she believes progress can be made after her frank talks with key creditor China last week. ZNBC reporter Paul Shalala has more.
United States Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has embarked on a two-day visit to Zambia at a time when the southern African country is looking to its international partners to resolve its debt crisis. Mylan, an American enterprise which manufactures antiretroviral and malaria drugs in the heart of the Zambian capital, Lusaka, was a first stop. The firm has so far employed 75 locals and targets to distribute drugs to over 30 million people across Africa. The Zambia National Public Health Institute is the Zambian government's surveillance arm which tracks diseases. Here, the American government has funded the establishment of an emergency operations center aimed at tracking outbreaks of diseases in Zambia and around the southern African region.
The United States remains committed to the work of improving regional and global health security, as is evidenced by our $450 million contribution to the newly launched Pandemic Fund. This fund will catalyze investments to fill critical gaps in pandemic preparedness and bolster overall health security.
The institute is currently helping neighboring Malawi contain an outbreak of cholera, which has claimed over 800 lives.
From the time you get an outbreak, within a period of 7 days, you are able to confirm that you have an outbreak, and within the day, you are able to really put together your pronouncements and put together your emergency response, and by the next 7 days, you should have mounted your response.
In an engagement with the media, Dr. Yellen touched on Zambia's debt and efforts being made to contain it.
It's critically important to allow Zambia to finance and make the investments that will be necessary and required to promote economic growth and sustainable development. So having a debt overhang is a drag on the entire economy. And not only is it important, it's critically important to address it right away. It's taken far too long already to resolve this matter.
During our two-day visit, Dr. Yellen is expected to meet President Hakainde Hichilema and hold high-level engagements with the Minister of Finance and the Central Bank. Her visit coincides with that of the International Monetary Fund Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, who is in the country to help Zambia in its debt restructuring process. In August 2022, Zambia obtained a $1.3 billion credit facility from the IMF, whose chief is here to check on progress made so far. Paul Shalala, ZNBC News in Lusaka.
Before leaving for Zambia, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen paid a solemn visit on Saturday to the salmon-colored house on an island off Senegal that is one of the most recognized symbols of the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade. Yellen, who was in the country as part of a 10-day trip aimed at rebuilding economic relationships between the U.S. and Africa, stood in the Goree Island building known as the House of Slaves and peered out of the door of no return from which enslaved people were shipped across the Atlantic.
Ultimately, Goree Island reminds us that the histories of Africa and America are intimately connected. Goree and the transatlantic slave trade are not just a part of African history, they are a part of American history too. And we know that the tragedy did not stop with the generation of humans taken from here. In the United States, what's remarkable is how many African American men and women overcame the odds, created better lives for themselves and their descendants, and became central to our economy and democracy, building our cities, powering our industries, and bending the conscience of the United States and the world toward justice. And all of this in the face of systemic social and economic injustice.
Yellen's trip to the island is one that many dignitaries have made, including former U.S. Presidents Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, as well as South Africa's Nelson Mandela. And now for a recap on Secretary Yellen's visit to Senegal, here's VOA's Abdulrahman Dia.
African tour is her visit to Gorée Islands, where thousands and thousands of slaves have transited to their way to the United States. The Secretary has acknowledged this tragic connection between Africa and the United States, but it is also part of the history that is shared by both Africa and the U.S. Prior to that, the Secretary of Treasury has emphasized the importance of having the mutually beneficial relationship between Senegal, between Africa and the United States. She laid out the economic strategy of the U.S. in the footsteps of the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit here in Washington that was in November. One of the first order of business during her visit to Senegal was to meet a young and woman entrepreneur. Africa, as you know, is the youngest continent in the world, and it is important for the U.S. to establish a strong relationship through the youth by investing in education, in digital and technology. Finally, the Treasury Secretary, without mentioning China or Russia, asserted the many programs through which the U.S. Is showing its commitment to Africa through programs like the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and also other development programs.
That was VOA's Abdulrahman Dia reporting. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, U.S. representative to the United Nations, will travel to Ghana, Mozambique, and Kenya from January 25th to the 29th to affirm and strengthen U.S. partnerships with key current and former UN Security Council members. Following on the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield's visit will advance shared priorities, including addressing regional security, reinforcing commitments to democracy and human rights, strengthening food security, supporting African resilience and recovery, and mitigating the effects of climate change. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was welcomed by his South African counterpart for talks in Pretoria on Monday, in a visit that has sparked criticism against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine. People from the Ukrainian Association of South Africa protested outside the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, where Minister of International Relations and Cooperation Naledi Pandor was hosting Lavrov for bilateral talks on Monday. The protesters held placards, "Stop Putin," "Child Murderer," "War Crime," and shouted slogans.
We really suffering big losses, and Ukraine, which were feeding South Africa and many other African countries, supplying grain. And actually, today we cannot do it because our country is at war, and South Africa is making friendly kind of arrangements with Russia, which basically invaded our country.
President Cyril Ramaphosa's government regards South Africa as neutral in the Ukraine conflict and has expressed a desire to mediate. Lavrov's second African visit in 6 months comes ahead of a Russia's Africa summit, which was postponed to July from last year because of the Ukraine conflict. We're excited to hear what you think about Africa 54 and all our VOA Africa programs on our website at voaafrica.com. Still to come, 64% of Americans disapprove of President Joe Biden's handling of classified documents. Stay with us.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Lino Khmoudou, in Washington every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
go.
In other news, Burkina Faso government says it has decided to end a military accord that allowed French troops to fight insurgents on its territory because the government wants the country to defend itself. Burkina is facing an Islamist insurgency by groups linked to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, which have taken over large strips of land and displaced millions of people. In laboratories in Tanzania and Nairobi, rats have been trained to sniff out tuberculosis. The African giant pouched rats have hero status when the scientists at the Apopo Project, a Belgian non-profit organization in Tanzania, say researchers say the animals work in 21 medical centers in Dar es Salaam. Thank God they don't have to be paid. And Human Rights Watch has denounced a report on Monday of deaths in detention, forced disappearances, and acts of torture related to the repression of demonstrations by Chadian authorities in October. At least 50 people were shot dead by security officials during demonstrations in the capital. A popular Cameroon radio journalist who had been missing following what a media rights group called an abduction has been found dead, according to his employer. Martinez Zogo was managing director of Yaoundé-based private radio station Amplitude FM and the star host of a popular daily program, Gridlock. The 51-year-old regularly aired cases of corruption, not hesitating to question important personalities by name. He had been missing since Tuesday. The death of Zogo was confirmed to AFP by a police source who spoke on condition of anonymity. A large crowd gathered as Zogo's body was taken to the morgue of Yaoundé Central Hospital for autopsy. Reporters Without Borders condemned what they called the brutal abduction of the journalist. Zogo's badly damaged car was found outside a police station in a suburb of the Cameroonian capital, Yaoundé, on Tuesday. A new poll indicates 64% of Americans believe U.S. President Joe Biden's handling of classified documents is inappropriate. The results of the ABC Ipsos poll were released as even more classified documents were found at Biden's residence. VOA's Veronica Balderas Iglesias has the details.
A series of notes and 6 additional documents with classified markings. That's what the FBI found after Friday's search of President Joe Biden's home in Delaware, with the U.S. leader's consent. Some papers date back to the time when Biden served as a senator. It could be a filing mistake, Democrat Senator Chris Coons told ABC's This Week.
And as the matters that you're handling are more important and occasionally more classified, the volume gets higher. So I do think this was inadvertent. I also don't think this is an issue that's keeping Americans up at night.
A new ABC News Ipsos poll conducted before the latest FBI search was revealed shows that 64% of Americans feel that President Biden acted inappropriately in handling classified documents. 77% of the public poll, though, consider former President Donald Trump's handling of classified materials he retained at his Florida home after leaving office even more serious. Both leaders are currently being investigated by special counsels appointed by the Department of Justice. A day before the FBI search, President Biden reiterated he's fully cooperating with the concerned authorities.
I think you're going to find there's nothing there. I have no regrets. I'm following what the lawyers have told me they want me to do.
Republican Representative Michael McCall told ABC the extent of the potential political fallout will depend on several factors.
You know, Watergate started as a very small burglary, and it led to the President of the United States resigning. So I don't know what's there until we see the documents. If there are national security documents relating to foreign nation adversaries.
Why both the current and the former president had classified documents in their possession rather than housed at the National Archives is a question for the independent prosecutors to dig into. Here's what Democrat Senator Joe Manchin told NBC's Meet the Press.
Did you intend to harm somebody? Did you intend to basically do an irresponsible thing? I don't think. Hopefully, neither one of them did.
Right.
But they sure turned out to be irresponsible.
He emphasized that the American people want accountability and that there should have been better checks and balances. Veronica Valderas Iglesias, VOA News, Washington.
And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.
We are appalled by Iran's executions of Mohammad Mehdi Karami and Mohammad Hosseini, and the sentencing, I should add, of additional individuals to death for involvement in protests. These two individuals were put to death following what can only be called sham trials that were rushed, that lacked any fair trial guarantees. We condemn these executions in the strongest terms. To see to it that the world's preeminent body in many respects has a standing commission that is solely and exclusively trained on the brutality that the Iranian regime is perpetrating against its own citizens. We're going to continue to help the Commission of Inquiry fulfill the mission that was set out for it, just as we continue to train the eyes of the UN, of our partners, on what's happening to the Iranian people.